Thank you very much, Dennis, and thank you to the organisers for inviting me to be here today. I really am delighted to be here, thrilled to be here. I loved when I got the invitation. I thought, yes, I'm going to do this if I can possibly do it. So I'm here and I'm loving every second of it. It's also great to share the podium with colleagues who are doing such great work in their fields, and to be part of a collective all working for a better understanding of our heritage and its protection and so on. Speaking of jazz, actually, the question came up beforehand about how did these saints become saints, and I was going to put my hand up and make a comment, but I thought I'll wait, about popular sainthood and how people just kind of become saints without being canonized. Some years ago, I was in San Francisco, and I went up to the Haight-Ashbury area, which is the home of Flower Power and the Grateful Dead and so on. I went to see the church of John Coltrane. I can tell most of you don't know who he is from the silence. I'm at the wrong conference. Coltrane was a great tenor saxophonist who died 50 years ago. And there's a church of John Coltrane, which is basically a typical sort of Haight-Ashbury, San Francisco house. But you go in and there's an altar, and there's a great sort of gold leaf illustration on the wall behind the altar of Coltrane. His name was John William, so they call him Saint John Will I Am Coltrane. And he's got a halo, and he's got a saxophone, and there are flames coming out of the saxophone. And I said to the two guys running the church of John Coltrane, we're Rastafarians, and we're listening to Bob Marley, which I'm fine with Bob Marley, but you got to listen to Train when you're in the Church of John Coltrane. But I said, when did John Coltrane become a saint? And they said, when we demoted him from God. So it is a form of popular sainthood. I don't know if Saint Aidan was good on the tenor sax or not. Probably not. It wasn't invented until the 19th century. Anyway. The rest of this is boring as far as I'm concerned. You get me onto music, as Dennis knows, and we're here for the day. The talk I'm going to give you today is based in part on a paper I co-wrote with colleague Rhiannon Carey-Bates for the Billy Colfer book on Ferns. I previously published an article on Ferns Castle, published on Diarmuid MacMurrough as a patron, so it seemed obvious that at some stage I'd turn my attention to the Cathedral. So I'm going to talk about the Cathedral, using stuff that's in that article, explaining verbally stuff that is more easily understood verbally than in an article. I can explain it better, I can teach it better, as it were. But I'm also going to stick in some additional comments and observations at the very end, which I think you might find useful. 1 second, let me get my gadget going. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to begin with a potted history of Ferns and the Cathedral for the first third or so of the lecture. I haven't timed this, so I may speed up or slow down at a certain stage. And then I'll go on to talk about the building and what we see. And then at the end, I'll make some general comments about the importance of buildings like this and what they tell us. Not just their importance in terms of heritage, monuments, and tourists and so on, though that's obviously very important, but their importance as portals into how the Middle Ages actually worked. So that's how it's going to work out, basically. So, simple potted history. It's an early monastic site. We've heard about Saint... I'm choosing to call him Aidan because all those Irish pronunciations are just too tricky. I've been at this long enough to know that if you ever try pronunciations of Old Irish names or Old Irish words, in front of an audience with a historian, you're just asking for trouble. So I'm going to call him Aidan. It's so much easier. He founds the monastery. A little word of caution around that word found, or founds. We imagine that when individual X founds monastery Y, there's a moment at which he says, let's have a church here, let's have a monastery here. And that's probably what happened in a lot of cases. But there may also be cases in which the presence of a holy man, of a venerated individual in a place for any period of time is itself a catalyst for something to be founded. So it's not that it's usually a he, actually founds a monastery. It is that a monastery develops in the place with the association while he's gone off someplace else. In Aidan's case, he's probably here. Late 6th century, question mark. As you heard from Jonathan, there's always uncertainty about these dates. The word monastery, we need to just stop there for a second as well. If you go back a generation or two, every early church site, every early medieval church site was called a monastic site. We're more cautious now. To be a monastery, you need to have a community of clerics who are following a monastic rule. They're following a set of regulations. And in the past, we assumed that every remains of an early church or every circular enclosure was a monastic site. That might not be the case. But here I think there is a monastery. There's a good argument for this being an actual monastery. There is a community here, probably quite small, but they're following some set of regulations. They're living a life according to a rule, which is what a definition of a monastery is. Excuse me. The third word there, bishops. Bishops are attached to this place. We know that from the early sources. These are not like modern or indeed high medieval bishops who've got defined territories, dioceses. These are bishops of the early church. Their territorial jurisdictions are a matter of some dispute. They probably didn't have them for the most part. They are needed sacramentally. They are needed as part of the church structure, but there's an awful lot of them, and it's one of the reasons why the Irish church is a little bit odd compared to other churches in Europe. So that's what we have. It's an early monastic site with bishops. The fact bishops are attached to it is a real indication, I think, of its importance. Fast forward into the 12th century. Ferns becomes a diocesan centre in the reform of the 12th century. Basically what happens is the Irish church's unusual practices have drawn the attention of the English church. Gentleman on the left here is Lanfranc, one of the famous archbishops of Canterbury. It's the English church, the church in Canterbury, that's agitating for the Irish church to reform itself. It's got odd practices, abbots passing on monasteries to their sons. They're not supposed to have sons, but they are. So there are a lot of abuses that need to be fixed. The English church is also agitating for reform for its own political purposes as well. In Cashel in the middle, in 1101, there is a synod at which the process of reform begins. And then in 1111, the date I have here, there's a great synod at a place called Rathbrazel, at which it's decided that Ferns is going to be one of the new bishoprics. It has an advantage, Ferns, in that Wexford doesn't have a bishop. It could have had, or the people of Wexford could have got themselves a bishop if they'd wanted to, being Scandinavian, but they hadn't, which left Wexford open for Ferns to take the diocesan seat instead. So it becomes a diocesan centre of the Reformed Church. It's part of the province of Cashel. It's the Archbishop of Cashel. The other Archbishop is in Armagh. The reason I put this here, Cashel up, is to remind me to say to you that Cashel is the place where the Reform movement really begins to gather pace. On the far right-hand side is Mellifont Abbey. Reform of the Irish Church was partly about creating a proper diocesan system, where you got a bishop and a diocese. It was also about opening the door for Reformed monasticism, Cistercianism, for Benedictines and Augustinians to come to Ireland, communities which followed recognised continental monastic rules. So it's a profoundly important event in Irish history. In 1152, Ferns' status as a diocese is maintained. This was another great synod, the Synod of Kells, Mellifont. At this synod, the system was fine-tuned. Some bishoprics lost out. Roscrea, for example, lost out. It was politically useful to break up Roscrea and share it among Killaloe and Ossory and so on. But Ferns held on, so it survived as a bishopric. And if it got to 1152 or 1153 as a bishopric, it stayed one, basically. I put up here Christ Church in Dublin and Tuam, because it was at that particular synod that there were 4 archbishops in Ireland: Cashel, Armagh, Dublin and Tuam, and that model survives to today. It's actually modelled on the English church. So 1152, there's a Cathedral of Ferns. Where is it? What did it look like? It's underneath us, probably. It's very likely that the original early monastic church wasn't significantly rebuilt to become a cathedral. That happened very little in Ireland before, the 13th century. It was probably altered a little bit, given new windows, or maybe enlarged a little bit. But basically, the Bishop of Ferns, from 1111 all the way through, is praying and running a diocese from within an older building that's simply been dolled up a little bit. Move on to 1162. Now we're in the age of Diarmuid MacMurrough. Excuse me. Here he is on the left-hand side. Diarmuid's a very interesting gentleman, as you know. He's surrounded by a culture of violence. He seems quite thuggish, but he's also a great supporter of the church. To us, that would be slightly hypocritical. That's simply what it was like being in the Middle Ages. He founded Augustinian and Cistercian monasteries. He had a certificate of confraternity from Bernard of Clairvaux, who was the senior Cistercian in the European order. So he's very highly regarded in church circles. And he founds the Abbey that's just across the field there, the Abbey of St. Mary, for Augustinian canons regular. Augustinian canons regular, a canon is a priest. A canon regular is a priest who lives a monastic life, a regulated life, and the regulated life that they follow is based on the rule of St. Augustine. Where have these Augustinian canons regular come from? That we don't know. It's very likely that they are native monastics who've been here all the way back, and that this is the moment in which they join the Reformed Church, and they do so by adopting the rule of St. Augustine. I don't think they necessarily need to have come far at all. 1183, we've got the first of three bishops I want to talk to you about briefly. Joseph Ojeda, he dies in 1183. And of course, you should instantly note two things here. Number one, he's got an Irish name. And number two, he dies 15 odd years after the invasion. So, although the Anglo Normans invade in 1169, thanks to Diarmuid, and they're here, they're in this area, there's an Irish bishop still here. They don't move him out. In England, they started moving out Anglo-Saxon bishops as early as they could. Here in Ireland, they allowed some stay on, as indeed here. Why so? I think there's probably a very simple explanation for that. The initial years of Anglo Norman activity in Ireland are very much about kind of state building, granting lands, getting people to swear fealty, getting soldiers in, building castles, promoting towns, etc., etc. The church can wait, basically. The church is fine. They're not too bothered about cathedrals, the Anglo Normans. They take their time before they replace the native bishops. The Anglo Normans are much more interested in founding monasteries, which they start doing from about the 1190s. And the reason is monasteries have better access to money. If you have a monastery, you get the tithes of the parish churches. So if you found monasteries, you can begin to gobble up the money that's in the countryside. So the first thing they do when they're dealing with the churches, they found monasteries. They leave the bishoprics just sort of sit for a little while longer. He dies in 1183. The next bishop to die is a really interesting individual, Diarmuid, Albano Malloy, if you want it in English, and he dies in 1223. If it's a surprise that there's a native-born bishop still here in 1183, it's an even bigger surprise to find 4 decades on, there's another Irish bishop. And this guy is extremely interesting. This man is one of the most interesting bishops of the 12th to 13th century period anywhere in Ireland. And his story can be summed up really by these 4 individuals I illustrate here. First of all, he had been an abbot of Baltinglass, which was a Cistercian abbey founded by Diarmuid MacMurrough. So he's a Cistercian. There are examples of Cistercians who take bishoprics in Ireland right through the Middle Ages. He is one. He's very friendly with the Anglo Normans. He's a supporter of John Cummin, who's the Archbishop of Dublin, for example. He witnesses various monastic transactions for the Anglo Normans in the Dublin area. So he's well embedded in English culture. When I say English, by the way, the Anglo Normans who invade, they would have called themselves English. We call them Anglo Norman. That name would mean nothing to them. They would have regarded themselves as English. Alba is embedded in that culture. He's familiar with it. But it's a sign of just how embedded he is and how he is favoured by the English, despite the fact that he is a native. Number one, this is Gerald of Wales, Geraldus Cambrensis, the man who witnessed the invasion and wrote about it. Gerald was a churchman. Gerald desired to be Bishop of Ferns and was kept out of the see by a native Irish man. Alba himself actually was really quite dismissive of English bishops. He didn't like them much and openly said so, and yet still held on to the bishopric here. So Gerald of Wales, who was his sworn enemy, they didn't like each other, they clashed. Gerald of Wales lost out on Ferns because this man is here and he's holding on and he's not being moved over. Next one across is Richard I. Richard the Lionheart, King of England, 1189 to 1199, the man who went on all the Crusades. Alba is at his consecration in Westminster Abbey. He's there when this man is crowned king. Again, he's an Irish bishop. Next one along is King John, Lord of Ireland and king of this corner of the world from 1199. John decides Alba would be a great Archbishop of Cashel and tries to maneuver him in. It doesn't happen, but nonetheless, here's an Irish bishop being touted by the king to take the principal archbishopric in the south of Ireland. And then finally, William Marshall, of course, and everyone knows the story. William Marshall appropriated church land. The bishop did his nut, got onto the Pope. The Pope excommunicated him. After his death, there's an attempt to put it all right, and Henry III says to Alba, look, I'll work on the Marshall family to get your land back. You sort of unexcommunicate him, etc., etc. Alba goes along to the grave with the family, and instead of saying, I forgive you, William, you're back in the fold, you're going back to heaven, etc., etc., he just stirs it up and makes it worse. He says, not only are you a bastard, but all your kids and family are as well, and there won't be any male heir, etc. And he just lost the head. Very courageously, I have to say, because these guys had swords. Thomas Becket, by the way, did something very similar and was murdered for it. But that shows you how connected this individual is. For a long time, even up to the article, I didn't think that he was responsible for rebuilding the cathedral. I'm now having second thoughts about that. I'm not so sure now. I think the cathedral rebuilding may have begun while he is bishop. And then we come to the first Anglo Norman bishop, John St. John. And like his predecessor, he has a very long tenure here. The effigy outside, actually down below, is him, I'm sure. Various other names have been suggested. No, it's him. The style fits his date. He's important enough to have got an effigy. He's a really senior bishop of the English Church in Ireland. There's the effigy there. The building behind us, the ruined building behind us, no one knows what it is. I don't know what it is either, but I think the effigy was almost certainly within it at some stage and moved from there into its current position. Certainly it fits architecturally the period of around the time that he dies. So it may have been built as a kind of a mortuary chapel or something for him. Anyway, there's a potted history. So it's an important diocese of the English Church, or the Anglo Norman Church in Ireland. Let's talk now about what the architecture tells us. The architecture tells us a certain amount. It's what we call Gothic or it was what we called Gothic architecture. Let me rephrase that. It was a building which, if it was still here, we would call it Gothic architecture, okay? What you're seeing today is an early 19th century church with bits of medieval fabric in it, particularly these bits here, these responds in here at the back, and there's another one down. There's 4 of these inside the structure. Gothic itself, just very briefly, is a style that developed in the Paris Basin in the middle of the 12th century. If there's a single church which is taken to start the style, it's the Church of Saint-Denis outside Paris. In the 1130s, the West Front was built. In the 1140s, the East End was built, and this is the first great Gothic work in Europe, and then later on, the rest of it was built. The Gothic style originated in the Paris Basin. It moved to England after there was a fire in Canterbury Cathedral. Fire started by the monks, by the way, almost certainly. They wanted a new shrine to Thomas Becket. They weren't going to get it from the king because the king killed him. So they thought, what better way to do it than to start a little fire so that it has to be repaired. And that's what they did, basically. And to repair it, they hired a French architect called William Massons, a man who had actually worked on the French cathedrals. And what he did basically was he stuck a Gothic building into the middle of the older church. It's the first time the English actually saw it. As soon as they saw it, the English adopted it. They adopted a very particular style of Gothic. It's called Early English. English Gothic is much lower in height. This is Salisbury. Whereas French churches tend to bring the eye up, English Gothic brings the eye along. So you get these very strong horizontal lines. English Gothic uses what we call thick wall passages. They built immensely thick walls, so thick that they were able to put little passages through them. And they also had particular motifs, such as this. This is called stiff leaf ornament. Very stylized plant ornament on capitals. And as you're looking at that, you might have a little look up there as well. I don't know what, there. So this is early English Gothic. This is what comes to Ireland. And if you want to see that, it's best go to Christ Church in Dublin. It's got the horizontal lines, the passages, it's got the stiff leaf and everything. It's a complete English building in Dublin. What about here? This is much more modest. Most cathedral churches, when they got around to rebuilding them, were modest. They weren't vaulted. This wasn't vaulted. They had sort of windows which were Gothic, they had some arches which were Gothic, but generally they had a lot of plain blank walling as well. There's not a lot of the original church here left, I'm afraid. There are bits of stonework around the place. These features I'll talk about in just a minute. And at the very back here, there's a double piscina, which is original. Some of the stones have been replaced, but that's original. These are little basins where the priest or the bishop washes the sacred vessels, washes his hands afterwards. They're part of the liturgy. So that's the only original liturgical furnishing left. It has survived the 19th century rebuilding. These are the responds. That's stiff leaf ornament. That is classic English Gothic. That's carved by somebody, if not trained in England, trained by somebody who trained in England. And the four, I'm going to go above, the four piers are here, there, and there's one missing. I don't want to zap anyone's pupils with this, but where Thomas Ellerington has got his ledger monument, and over here where William Cosgrave, there's a missing pier here and a missing pier here. So it's a pair of arches. This is fun, actually. It's a pair of arches going like this. I feel like a weatherman. It's a front moving in from the east. Okay. The east end of the church is a bit of a puzzle. I think this is the original east end wall. The fenestration is extremely odd. The windows are extremely odd. They've got bits of medieval carved stone in them. Hard to make real sense of it. Austin Cooper drew it in the 18th century, and the windows are here. You can actually see that these are not a creation of the 19th century. I think they may even be late medieval. I think they're from the Middle Ages, but from the end of the Middle Ages would be my guess. And some of the outside windows, the lancets on the outside, down here. But look at the little roundel underneath. That's an original feature of Gothic architecture. There's a little round window missing from there. So it's got all the bits and pieces, got all the elements. In terms of a plan, Alfred Clapham, the great Alfred Clapham, reconstructed a plan like this. Cooper gave us this drawing of the cathedral, so Clapham drew it like this. I studied this quite a lot when I was working with Rhiannon on the paper. I think Clapham got it wrong. I think it's like this. I think it had a very long east end along here, and I think it had transepts, certainly, and it had aisles running along the side of this part of the church, and that you descended here into the crypt and then back out possibly on this side. You need to get into the crypt. You don't get into the crypt from the body of the church. You need to come in from the side. That's why I think it has this. I don't know how long it was. I think it was probably quite long. What I've reconstructed here by combining what I can see and what Austin Cooper drew is a big cathedral, plain but big, with provision for a complex liturgy. and perhaps at some stage the relic of St. Aidan, or a relic down in the crypt worthy of veneration. It has been suggested that the effigy was down in the crypt. The effigy wasn't in the crypt. They didn't put effigies in crypts. They're way too dark. Let me put Ferns in chronological context for you, and then explain to you why I think we need to know about this type of Gothic architecture, and how thinking about this type of architecture will allow us to understand the world of the 13th century a little bit better. Here's a timeline, 1160 to 1300. There's the invasion roughly there. England, Gothic appears shortly after the Anglo Normans have invaded Ireland, the 1170s, Canterbury and Wells and so on. So the first Anglo Normans who came to Ireland didn't know about Gothic architecture at all. The style carries on in England until about the year 1240, when the English change it. They rebuild Westminster Abbey, and it causes them to create a new type of architecture. Here in Ireland, Gothic comes in the 1190s. It's a little bit late coming in here. That has partly to do with, the lordship bedding down, partly to do with money, partly to do with their own familiarity with what this new style is. So there's a time lag. That's really no big deal. I think St. Thomas's in Dublin, which is now gone, is the very first. I've argued in print a few times that there's very good evidence to suggest it was a Gothic building. That's 1192. Grey Abbey, County Down, Cistercian, 1193. And I think the first sign of it crossing the Shannon might be Cong from about 1203. So look, it's beginning to arrive around the year between 1195 and 1205, that 10-year period. You'll notice that these examples I've given you, I can give you others, are monastic churches. For the reason, as I said to you already, by founding monasteries, they're able to get access to parish tithes and so on. So founding monasteries is of value to them. It's only as the 13th century unfolds that they begin to turn their attention to the rebuilding of cathedrals and to the putting in place of their own bishops. Dublin, about 1215. Kildare, Ferns are all around the 1220 period. Why does it take them so long? Well, I've given you one explanation. There is another explanation for it. It is partly the case that none of the Irish cathedrals before the invasion had a dean and chapter, had a capitular body, a body of officials attached to the cathedral to run the diocese. The Irish didn't have it. There's no evidence of it at all. And in order to run a successful diocese, you need to have these bodies in place. And my sense would be that the Anglo-Normans are spending time creating these bodies. Because they're not already here, they need to be set up. So the process of taking over a cathedral involves creating the administrative structure for the cathedral. The administrative structure of the cathedral will then raise the money to help rebuild the cathedral, and that's what causes the delay. And that's why it's in the 1220s or thereabouts that we see Gothic appearing in our cathedrals, such as here. Ferns actually is quite interesting in that when John St. John becomes bishop, there's immediately a capitular body. There's immediately an administration in Ferns. And it's unusual in that regard. Myself and Rhiannon argue in our article in the Billy Colfer book that the previous bishop, Bishop Alba, actually installed that body. He's a Gaelic Irish bishop who gives the cathedral its administrative structure. And the more I think about that, the more I'm inclined to think that Ferns might actually have been started under the Irish bishop, that we don't have to wait until John St. John at all. So that's where Ferns fits. I just want to make three comments before I close about why this stuff is interesting and important for us. What does it mean for us? Obviously this is a heritage, so it's it's part of our story, and you can attract tourists to these places, and they like to see and be interested in what these things are. You can tell lots of stories, and it's great. But think of the bigger picture. How are we to understand the Middle Ages from this particular heritage? What does it tell us that we have, this type of ornament up here? What does it tell us that we have a piscina? What does it tell us that this was a long cathedral built in a certain period? What insight does that give us into Anglo-Norman Ireland? Can we get away from the, in a sense we have as a people, thankfully, but can we get away from the old 800 years of English oppression nonsense? The past is more complicated. Can we understand the nuance a little bit better? And I think we can. I think we can by thinking about what this style of architecture is actually telling us. Number one, Gothic. The architecture of these features here, the architecture that was here in the early 13th century, it was the aesthetic fingerprint of the lordship in Ireland. This is what people saw. They saw it in parish churches. Elizabeth was talking earlier about going to Mass on a Sunday in the early church, and could you get away with not doing it? And maybe you could, we don't know. Certainly in the 13th century, it was customary for people to go every Sunday. How strictly that was enforced, one doesn't know, but you were expected to get the Eucharist every Sunday. And you did pay tithes to your local church. So the only building in the community to which everybody would go would be a parish church. The one building in which everybody, regardless of status, set foot. And they're Gothic buildings. So it is the visual appearance of the colony of the lordship in Ireland. For us today, it's in fragments, but back then, that's what they saw. This is the stuff that's all over the place, whether it's a parish church of New Ross or a friary in Buttevant. So it's the aesthetic of the colony. It's how it looked. You can step back into the physical experience of being back in 13th century Ireland when you walk into these buildings. Number two, we can use this style to map the development of lordship in Ireland. What I mean basically is, here is Ballybogan in Meath from about 1200. It's very early on. Look at the church, it's almost military. They're jittery, they're still nervous. It's a new colony. By the time you get to Rathfran in County Mayo in the 1270s, look at all the windows. They're more comfortable, it's more prosperous. The danger has passed. So I could give a lecture on the progression and stabilization of the English in Ireland by just looking at how Gothic evolves. And the third point is we can understand identity formation, that it's not about the Irish versus the English, the goodies and the baddies. It's much more complex. As you would expect, it's much more complex. The people on the ground have to deal with each other, and they borrow ideas from each other. And politically, they may be opposed to each other, but the reality of living together means they need to get on. And we can see that in lots of ways in the archaeological record, but we can see it in the architecture. Cong Abbey is built by an O'Connor, and yet it's got pieces of English architecture. Athenry Friary is built by a succession of English and Irish patrons working side by side. An Irish guy pays for the altar, an English guy pays for the window. And this is all documented. So this architecture tells us about how complex identity is in the Middle Ages and weans us away from the very simplistic notion that there are goodies and baddies, the baddies are English, and we're the good guys. To finish, Ferns. There's not enough left here, unfortunately, to comment on how this architecture came about, to comment on its genealogy. I could speculate based on how I reconstructed it, but it would be speculation. Unfortunately, there's just not enough here. There's something which is great, but there's not enough. But I suppose you could say that while I cannot talk to you about identity formation in Anglo Norman Ireland using the architecture of Ferns Cathedral, I can certainly do so using the history of Ferns Cathedral and the fact that the dominant bishop in the early history of this diocese, up to 70 years after the invasion, was an Irishman. And if that doesn't shake your adherence to this 700 years of English domination nonsense, nothing will. So thank you very much.